Mateo was 22 years old and spent most of his days with his hands stained with grease and his face burned by the strong sun of a small inland town. The small workshop where he worked was on the corner of a busy street, surrounded by modest houses, neighboring workshops, and the constant smell of gasoline mixed with the metallic sound of clanging tools. He would arrive before the owner opened the gate and often leave only after the last customer had gone. There, among pistons, belts, and disassembled engines, was where he felt complete. The world made sense when he heard the roar of an engine coming back to life, as if every piece in its place also set its own feelings in order. He was a young man with gentle speech, attentive eyes and steady hands, who preferred listening before giving his opinion, and, when he spoke, each word was laden with calm and precision. Since childhood, Mateo had demonstrated a rare gift. Not only did he take apart toys to understand how they worked, but he also managed to put together better versions, adapted with creativity and a skill that impressed even the adults around him. He grew up in a small house with peeling walls and an improvised garden made of repurposed flower pots, alongside a mother who was a seamstress and a stepfather who worked as a truck driver. He never lacked affection, but everything he achieved came with great effort. Money was scarce, and dreams were often postponed. Still, he carried a discreet sparkle in his eyes, as if deep down he already knew that life could offer something greater. Not out of arrogance, but from a quiet certainty that he had something valuable to offer the world: his talent. If you have ever felt that the world does not see all that you carry inside, stay with us until the end of this story. And if it touches you in any way, go ahead and like, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Mateo had already learned to deal with the silent prejudice that hovered around his craft. But there were days when even the emotional resilience he had cultivated since adolescence could not completely shield him. One such day began like any other. The sun had barely risen when he unlocked the rusty latch on the workshop gate. He wore his blue shirt stained with oil, and even before the first customer arrived, he was already under a car hood, trying to solve a problem in the ignition system of an imported car. Everything seemed to be going normally until, at the end of the morning, the engine noises were interrupted by the shrill laughter of a group parking a convertible on the other side of the street. They were three young people known in town, sons of local businessmen, arrogant and always surrounded by admiring glances wherever they went. They did not come there out of necessity. They came purely to mock. The leader of the trio, a young man with a cynical smile and hair meticulously combed to the side, was called Arthur. He was the kind of person who spoke too loudly just to be noticed and strutted through the world as if every space were an extension of his own backyard. As he approached the workshop, he immediately began to mock the surroundings, pointing at the old tools, at Mateo's dirty uniform, and making comments laden with irony. "Look at that, the genius of mechanics with his 1980 high-tech hub," he said in a tone of scorn, while the others laughed heartily. Mateo did not answer. He only stared fixedly at the part he was assembling, as if the sound of the taunts could not break the focus he had on that engine. But inside, he felt the hot blood rising to his face, not out of shame, but from the bitter feeling of injustice. He knew the value of what he did there. He knew how much that space, no matter how modest, was the stage where his talents blossomed day after day, and where no one saw it except those who truly understood what it meant to be a mechanic at heart. That afternoon, after the group left, laughing as if they had just watched a cheap comedy, Mateo continued working as if nothing had happened. But the truth was that humiliation kept echoing within him, even as he assembled the toothed belt with surgical precision. He did not allow himself to lose focus. He had learned to transform discomfort into productivity, pain into discipline. Yet it was impossible to ignore the lump in his throat when he remembered the mocking looks, the muffled laughter, and the feeling of being invisible to those who only saw value in last names and expensive clothes. While testing the engine's rotation, he felt a tightening in his chest. It was not just sadness. It was the accumulated frustration of years trying to prove that talent has no social class, that grease-stained hands carry as much dignity as a well-pressed suit. At the end of the day, when the silence of the workshop finally replaced the clamor of the tools, Mateo sat alone on the wooden bench by the entrance. He stayed there for a few minutes, looking at the sky now tinted orange by the late afternoon. Sometimes all he wanted was to be able to shout to the world who he truly was, not by his father's name, but by what that name represented, proof that he was no less than anyone else. But the promise he had made to himself still rang strongly. He would only succeed on his own merit. His father, that man with a rigid expression and measured speech, had made it clear from early on that he would not interfere in his journey, and Mateo accepted that challenge with a heavy heart, but with the conviction that one day everyone would recognize his worth. The problem was enduring the path until that day arrived. The next day, Mateo woke up before sunrise, as he always did. He didn't even need an alarm. The routine was ingrained in his body. But that morning, something was different. He had slept little, his mind restless, reliving every detail of what had happened in the workshop. Still, he got up without complaint, had a simple coffee with stale bread, and grabbed his old backpack where he kept a few tools he preferred to carry with him. The way to work was short, but he liked walking, listening to the sound of the city awakening. It was in those solitary minutes that he organized his thoughts and fueled his motivation. Deep down, he knew that every step taken on that narrow sidewalk was part of a greater journey, a path that no one else saw, but that he walked with silent determination. When he arrived at the workshop, he was greeted by Mr. Elias, the owner of the shop, a man in his 60s with disorganized white hair and a somewhat grumpy demeanor, but a generous heart. Elias knew that Mateo was different. He had seen many apprentices come through, but none with that meticulous look and almost artisanal patience. "You're going to go far, kid," he used to say, even in a dry tone, as if trying to hide affection behind a scowl. That morning, however, Elias noticed something in Mateo's expression. There was a contained tension, a silence denser than usual. "Did something happen?" he asked directly as he opened the workshop door. Mateo only smiled slightly and shook his head. He did not want to seem weak, nor give room for the pain to grow. He preferred to immerse himself in work and let his actions speak for him. After all, in that workshop, he was still just the neighborhood mechanic, and that was how he wanted to prove his worth. The day passed like many others. Sounds of lug, wrenches, the strong smell of burnt oil, and a constant line of cars with problems that seemed to test the customer's patience. But for Mateo, all of that was almost therapeutic. He managed to find logic even in the chaos of failing systems, as if his mind deciphered the noises and tremors with a precision no one else could achieve. Around noon, an old sports car arrived at the workshop, its engine faltering and with a glossy paint job that completely contrasted with the surrounding scene. The owner was an older man, with an elegant posture and measured gestures. He said he had already taken the vehicle to 3 different workshops, and no one had managed to solve the problem. Elias, in his direct manner, pointed to Mateo. "If anyone here can handle it, it's that young man right there." The man raised an eyebrow, as if in doubt, but allowed the young man to inspect the car. Mateo didn't even blink. He opened the hood with the naturalness of someone who already knew what he was looking for, and in a few minutes he was lying under the vehicle, examining details that few technicians would notice. Meanwhile, the client observed with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The young man didn't wear gloves. He preferred to feel each part with his own hands, as if direct contact helped him understand better what was out of place. After about 20 minutes, he stood up, wiped his hands with a grimy cloth, and explained simply that the defect was in a component that had been replaced with a poorly adjusted aftermarket part. a tiny detail that compromised the entire engine's performance. The client was surprised. None of the other workshops had noticed that. When Mateo started the car and the engine ran perfectly, the man gave a discreet yet genuine smile. "You have golden hands, kid," he said, with a firm handshake and a look that, for the first time that day, made Mateo feel truly seen. The repercussion of that repair was greater than Mateo had imagined. 2 days later, the same client returned to the workshop, but this time accompanied by another man, a retired mechanical engineer who now worked as a consultant for a magazine specialized in classic cars. "I was talking about him," the client said while pointing to Mateo, who was focused on aligning a suspension system. The consultant excused himself, asked technical questions, and observed with genuine interest how the young man worked. It was not common to find someone with such dexterity and sensitivity to details, especially in a neighborhood workshop. That very day, Mateo was invited to participate in a small regional event, a kind of gathering of mechanics, restorers, and automotive enthusiasts. At first, he hesitated. He had never participated in anything like that. He did not see himself as someone who deserved to be there, among renowned professionals and car enthusiasts. But Elias insisted, "You have no idea what can happen when you start showing what you know." The following week, he found himself facing a completely new reality. He arrived at the event wearing his faded blue shirt and oil-stained trousers, while the other participants wore impeccable uniforms and carried state-of-the-art tools. Still, Mateo stood out. Not because of his appearance, but because of the way he explained solutions clearly, demonstrated techniques with precision, and solved problems live with a natural ease that impressed even the most experienced. During a practical demonstration, he was called to diagnose a specific noise in an old V6 engine. He listened for less than 2 minutes, asked 2 simple questions, and pinpointed the defect, a slight misalignment in the camshaft caused by a poorly executed replacement weeks earlier. The audience, composed of technicians, engineers, and even dealership owners, fell silent for a few seconds before breaking into applause. In that moment, Mateo understood that perhaps he was, for the first time, being recognized not only as a good mechanic, but as a rare talent. The impact of that event began to spread through the city like a thread of oil, slowly seeping under the workshop floor, discreet yet impossible to contain. The next day, a local journalist arrived at the workshop to do a small feature on the young mechanical talent who enchanted experts. Mateo was taken aback. He did not know how to act in front of a recorder and a camera, and he responded in a simple manner with that calm and direct demeanor that defined him. The article appeared in the Sunday newspaper, and even without major graphic highlights, made a huge impact. New clients began to show up, curious to see up close the guy who listens to engines as if they were music, as the headline declared. But along with admiration came discomfort. The same young people who once mocked Mateo now looked at him with a mixture of surprise and resentment. Artur, in particular, seemed bothered by the attention the mechanic was starting to receive. In the corridors of the engineering college where Artur studied, Mateo's name began circulating among the professors. One of the lecturers, an expert in high-performance engines, commented in class about the self-taught mechanic who solved problems that many engineers had overlooked. This struck a nerve with Artur, who refused to accept that someone without a degree, without a famous last name, and without even finishing high school was receiving so much recognition. In an act of pure vanity, he decided to challenge Mateo publicly. He appeared at the workshop with an invitation in hand, or rather a challenge, a regional mechanical competition where teams would have to disassemble, identify flaws, and reassemble complex engines within a set time. "Let's see if you really are all that," he said with a forced smile and a look full of provocation. Mateo took the invitation, looked at Elias, and replied simply, "I'm in." There was no anger in his voice, There was only conviction, and at that moment, something inside him began to change. Mateo had never participated in a competition of that magnitude, but he did not hesitate for a second to accept. Deep down, he knew he was not just competing for a trophy or a title. He was facing everything that had haunted him since he was a child: prejudice, others' arrogance, and the feeling of invisibility. In the following days, he immersed himself completely in preparations. He spent hours studying new engine models, seeking alternative solutions, testing old parts, and creating his own techniques to save time without sacrificing precision. Elias watched everything with silent admiration. The old owner of the workshop, accustomed to seeing so many mechanics give up halfway, saw in Mateo something rare. A thirst for overcoming challenges that did not depend on applause or recognition, but on an inner sense of dignity. On the day of the competition, the environment was completely different from what Mateo was used to. It was a huge hall, filled with sponsor banners, intense lights, and cameras positioned in every corner. Uniformed teams roamed about with state-of-the-art tools, digital timers, and printed score sheets. Mateo was there with his old toolbox and the stained coverall he wore every day at the workshop. Yet he maintained his usual demeanor, focused, quiet, observant. When the judges initiated the first phase, the engine diagnosis, he was the last to begin. Not out of insecurity, but because he preferred to analyze calmly before making any move. While the others disassembled parts quickly, he observed every vibration, listened to every sound, felt the texture of the cables. When he finally put his hands on the engine, everything seemed to make sense. His time was shorter than that of the others, and his diagnosis was the only one completely correct. That left the audience silent for a few moments. For the first time, Mateo was not just the workshop guy. He was the competitor who was changing the course of the game with his own hands. As the stages advanced, Mateo earned the respect of even the most experienced competitors. His approach was different. There was no rush in his movements. Each action was measured down to the millimeter. While some tried to impress with speed, he impressed with precision. Every tightened screw, every aligned part, every adjusted control carried a level of care that revealed more than technique. It revealed passion. The judges, initially skeptical of this young man with a simple appearance and modest tools, began exchanging glances and jotting down discreet comments. The audience, which at first barely noticed him, now approached to see up close what he was doing. Even the photographers turned their lenses toward him, and Arthur, who had entered the competition sure that he would give Mateo a lesson, began to realize that he was about to be swallowed by his own arrogance. During the final phase of the test, in which the competitors had to completely assemble a high-performance engine from scratch, Mateo maintained his composure. While others made small mistakes out of nervousness or tried to take shortcuts, he stayed true to his essence, piece by piece, with total attention and an almost reverential respect for the process. When he finished his assembly, the engine started on the first try. The clean, uniform sound filled the hall like an indisputable sign of excellence. The vibration that swept through the space was almost palpable. Some people exchanged glances, others spontaneously applauded. Even the judges, usually reserved, stood up in a sign of respect. Mateo simply took a deep breath, lowered his head in a humble gesture, and wiped his sweaty hand on his coverall. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He only looked at Elias, who was in the corner of the hall, his eyes teary and his chest filled with pride. That was all he needed. At the end of the competition, while everyone awaited the official announcement of the results, Mateo stood in a corner, leaning against the wall, far from the spotlights. He had never been comfortable on stages or with public speaking, and the thought of stepping onto a podium made him more nervous than any malfunctioning engine. But when his name was called as the absolute winner of the contest, there was no escaping it. The applause was strong and prolonged, and this time it came not only from the curious, it came from experts, from competitors, from people who sincerely recognized the talent they had just witnessed. He went up on the small makeshift stage, received the trophy from the hands of the president of the Regional Mechanical Federation, and for a brief moment looked at the shining object as if he did not quite know what to do with it. For many, that was the symbol of victory. For Mateo, it was just another step, perhaps the most symbolic yet, of a journey built on silent effort. Shortly after the award ceremony, the buzz began. Some media outlets present at the event wanted to interview him, others only took photographs. Mateo tried to maintain his composure, but the sudden exposure made him uncomfortable. One of the reporters insisted on asking about his origins, his training, and where all that skill came from. He answered with few words, always steering clear of the part he most wanted to keep secret, his true identity. Only Elias knew everything, and even then, out of mutual trust and loyalty, they never touched on that subject. But the media's curiosity grew with every new article published. Some websites even began to investigate his story. One even raised rumors about a possible relation to the owner of one of the country's largest automotive industries. Mateo pretended not to be shaken, but inside he felt the pressure mounting. It was as if the past he had so carefully hidden was about to come knocking. Gradually, Mateo's name began to surpass the limits of the town. Workshops from other regions wanted to meet him, interview invitations arrived by email, and even specialized tool brands began seeking him out for possible partnerships. Yet he kept his feet on the ground, working daily in the same workshop with the same discipline and humility as always. Elias joked that if he continued like that, the neighborhood would have to change the street's name to Mateo of the Motors Street. But what no one saw was the inner conflict growing within the young man. On the outside, he appeared unshakable. Inside, he struggled daily with the idea of revealing or not who his father was. There was a weight in that secret that was becoming increasingly difficult to bear, especially now that the world was beginning to pay attention to him. And as much as he told himself he wanted to succeed on merit, there was a knot tightening inside him, the fear of being discovered before he was ready. One quiet night, after another hard day's work, Mateo received a phone call that changed everything. It was his father. The voice on the other end was firm, as always, but there was a different tone, a kind of contained pride, almost hesitant. "I saw your presentation at the competition. You were brilliant," he said. Mateo was silent for a few seconds, clutching the phone tightly. It was rare to receive this kind of contact. Although they maintained minimal communication over the years, their conversations had always been brief, formal, and full of gaps. "I want you to come to the automotive industry gala next week. It will be a good opportunity for you to be officially introduced." The proposal hit him like lightning. He did not answer immediately. He just listened. He felt his chest tighten and his breath grow heavy. It was the kind of invitation that could change everything or erase everything he had built on his own. In the following days, Mateo barely slept. The idea of being at a corporate gala surrounded by executives, journalists, and shareholders made him uneasy, not out of fear of not fitting into that environment, but because of the risk of erasing, with one single appearance, the entire image he had so painstakingly built on the workshop floor. How would people see him afterward? Would they continue to value his talent or start seeing him only as the son of the owner? That was the question that pounded in his head. Even so, he decided to accept the invitation, not as a way to promote himself, but as a necessary step to deal with what he had avoided for years. He borrowed a suit from a friend in the neighborhood, bought new shoes with the little money he had saved, and had his hair cut at a simple salon where he felt comfortable. He did not want to appear as someone he was not. He only wanted to be minimally presentable before an environment that had always excluded him. When he arrived at the event, He felt all eyes turned toward him as soon as he entered the hall, lit by enormous chandeliers and surrounded by impeccably set tables. He had never been in such a sophisticated place. The ambient sound was low, the conversations filled with corporate jargon, and the smiles seemed rehearsed. But what bothered him most was not the luxury. It was the artificiality of the environment. Even so, he walked confidently, even though he felt his heart pounding in his throat. He was greeted by one of his father's assistants, who led him to the main table. There, surrounded by influential people, Mateo was introduced as the heir of the automotive group. Some expressed surprise. Others feigned nonchalance. He only smiled politely without lingering on greetings. He did not want speeches or tributes. At that moment, he only wanted to honor his journey without letting the brilliance of that night overshadow the truth he carried. Everything he had achieved so far had come from the workshop floor, not from the name printed on a badge. During dinner, Mateo remained almost entirely silent, observing around him as if trying to decipher another kind of engine. The engine of social relationships, of power plays, of measured words. At one point, one of the company directors gave a speech praising the new talent emerging not only as an heir, but as a symbol of a new generation of professionals passionate about automotive engineering. Mateo nodded discreetly in gratitude, but inside he felt discomfort. He knew that narrative did not reflect his truth. He was not an heir who decided to get involved out of curiosity. He was a mechanic who had built himself on the fringes of it all, often with calloused hands and wounded self-esteem. Therefore, when he had the opportunity to speak, he was direct. "I appreciate the recognition, but if you allow me, I would like to start as an apprentice, just like anyone else. I only feel comfortable when I'm close to the parts, the engines, the tools." The response generated a disconcerting silence, followed by some awkward smiles and exchanged glances among the executives. But Mateo's father, sitting next to him, simply nodded silently. He knew that that request carried the weight of everything built behind the scenes, and deep down, he felt proud. After that night, Mateo began splitting his days between work at the workshop and a training program within the company. He gained access to technologies he had never imagined, participated in training with top engineers, and was introduced to industrial processes he had only known through books before. But even surrounded by innovation, he never stopped returning to the neighborhood, entering the old workshop with its smell of grease and tightening bolts with the same careful attention as always. It was there, among worn cables and old engines, that he recharged his essence. Because, in the end, it wasn't the badge that defined him. It was the sound of an engine tuned to perfection. The double routine required much more than physical strength. It required emotional balance. Mateo, now known nationally, saw his name printed in reports, podcasts, and even in viral videos showcasing his journey. People who once ignored him now approached him with easy compliments and forced smiles. Some old schoolmates added him on social networks with messages like, "I always knew you'd go far," even though they barely remembered his face. But what surprised him most was the behavior of Artur and his friends. After all the disdain and humiliation, they now appeared smiling at events, trying to strike up conversations as if nothing had happened. "You're the man. Mateo, we need to hang out sometime," they said, trying to erase the past with empty words. Mateo listened with respect, but without being fooled. He knew exactly who had stayed by his side in silence, and who only appeared when the spotlight was already on. One afternoon, while organizing some tools in the workshop, he received an unexpected visit from Artur. He arrived alone, without his old cronies, with a more subdued expression than usual. He said he wanted to talk, that he had rethought some of his attitudes, that he admired what Mateo had achieved. "We were jerks. I was a jerk," he admitted, looking into the mechanic's eyes. Mateo listened in silence, without interrupting. He was not there to judge or to fuel resentments, but he did not feel obligated to forgive immediately. Everyone knows the path they take, Arthur, and what you sow will come back eventually. Just don't confuse respect with opportunity, he replied in a calm but firm tone. The conversation ended without promises, without warm handshakes, just an honest silence between two men who finally saw each other without masks. And for Mateo, that was enough. The months passed, and Mateo remained steadfast in his purpose. Even with the changes, he continued to have lunch at the same corner bar, greeting neighbors by name and insisting on maintaining his simple routine. When he went to the company headquarters, he caused a bit of a stir. He arrived by bus, wearing ordinary clothes, without bodyguards or luxury cars. Some employees at first doubted his position. Others whispered in the corridors, trying to understand how such a discreet young man could be the direct heir to the presidency. But one only had to see him working in the testing labs, solving problems with the same patience he used to align a carburetor in the neighborhood, to understand that there was more there than just a name. There was an essence. Mateo was not impressed by titles. He felt more comfortable among the workers than in board meetings, and it was in that contrast that he built his bridge between two worlds. Then came a new invitation, a national mechanical competition even larger than the previous one. This time, with international sponsors, live broadcasting, and coverage by the specialized press. At first, Mateo hesitated. He had already proven his worth. He no longer needed to expose himself, much less feed the curiosity of those who only wanted to see up close the mechanic who became an heir. But after a conversation with Elias, he realized that this would be a new opportunity, not to assert himself, but to inspire, to show other young people like him that it is possible to succeed without abandoning one's own truth. He decided to accept the challenge, but on one condition. He would compete not as a representative of his father's company, but as an independent professional. He wanted his story to continue being told through his own choices, and not by the spotlights that insisted on illuminating only his last name. The preparations for the new competition began intensely. Mateo knew that this time he would be under a different kind of pressure. He was no longer the unknown whose talent surprised people. Now everyone expected him to be perfect. Any mistake would be amplified. Any slip-up would become headline news. But he stayed true to his way of doing things, unhurried, without vanity, with his feet firmly on the ground. He assembled his own team from old workshop, colleagues, simple but dedicated people who trusted him not because of his name, but because of their daily interaction and the ethics with which he always conducted his work. He refused pompous sponsorships and even offers to wear branded uniforms. He wanted to keep his identity clean, without interference. For him, true strength lay in work done with honesty. And that was what he wanted to bring to this new stage. On the eve of the competition, Mateo could hardly sleep, not out of insecurity, but because his mind was teeming with ideas, strategies, and technical details. He arrived early at the event venue, once again carrying his personal toolbox as a ritual. The environment was even grander than that of the previous competition. Giant screens spread throughout the space, packed stands, and expert commentators narrating every move of the competitors. But none of that intimidated him. When he put his hands on the first engine of the test, all external noise vanished. It was as if he were back in his small workshop, with the smell of oil in the air and the sunlight striking the rusty workbench. The connection to what he did was so natural, so genuine, that any audience seemed irrelevant. It was just him and the engine, as it always had been. And so, with calm, precision, and passion, Mateo began to show once again that true talent does not need a stage. It only needs space to exist. The first stage of the competition was technical and exhausting. Participants had to diagnose, hidden defects in the complex electronic systems of modern vehicles, something that required more than knowledge. It required sensitivity, attention, and quick reasoning. Mateo surprised everyone once again. While others analyzed with scanners and software, he preferred to begin with listening, with touch, with sight. He used technology as support, not as a guide, and that impressed everyone. His ability to unite the old with the new, the intuitive with the technical, as if he moved naturally between the two worlds. The judges took notes in silence, and the commentators, who initially referred to Mateo as the curious heir, began to change their tone. Here we have someone who represents not just a family name, but a visceral understanding of how engines work. It's rare to see that, commented one of the experts live. In the second phase, the challenge was to assemble an electronic injection system from scratch, with limited time and assorted parts. A high-level technical puzzle. Mateo stood out once again. Not only did he assemble everything with precision, but he was the only one who suggested an improvement to the system during execution, optimizing the engine's performance. The audience, accustomed to standardized displays, reacted with spontaneous applause. That was not common in such formal competitions, yet it was impossible not to recognize the uniqueness of that calm young man with simple speech and steady hands, who transformed each task into a little mechanical work of art. At the end of the second day, Mateo was already being named the favorite, but he did not let it go to his head. He knew that every stage required total concentration and that any slip could jeopardize everything. So when he left the event, instead of going out to dinner with other competitors, he went home, had rice with egg for dinner, and went to bed early. The next day, everything would start over, and he wanted to be whole. The third day of the competition dawned, cloudy, with a heavy atmosphere, as if the sky reflected the backstage tension. It was the final phase, the most anticipated, the most demanding, and also the most symbolic. Each competitor had to assemble, adjust, and get a state-of-the-art hybrid engine working, a fusion of mechanical tradition and electric technology, with very little margin for error. Mateo arrived early, as always, and spent a few minutes in silence, sitting near the assembly area. He did not review notes or check his tools. He simply took a deep breath, as if preparing not only his body, but also his mind for what was to come. When his name was called, he got up calmly and walked to the workbench, as if he already knew every screw in that system, even though he had never worked with that specific model before. While the other participants raced against time, Mateo maintained the same steady pace that had always accompanied him. It was as if the clock did not dictate the rhythm, but rather the internal logic of his own knowledge. He started with the electrical connection points, then moved on to the mechanical adjustments, and only then integrated the two systems. He remained calm, even when something did not fit as it should, testing, correcting, adjusting without despair, and it was precisely that attitude that made the difference. While other competitors stumbled with small errors caused by nervousness, Mateo continued as if he were alone in his workshop, listening to the engine's sound more than any external noise. When he finally finished the assembly and started the system, the hybrid engine ran with surprisingly efficient performance, above the average of standard tests. The judges, who already admired him, were visibly impressed. It was more than technique. It was complete mastery of what he did, and perhaps a kind of talent that cannot be taught, only honed. When the competition's closing was announced, the audience had no doubt about who would emerge as the winner. Yet, even amid the general expectation, Mateo maintained his usual discreet demeanor. While others celebrated prematurely, he simply put away his tools carefully, one by one, as he did every day in the workshop. There was no arrogance in his gestures, only respect for the process and for everything that moment represented. When he was called to the stage to receive the champion's trophy, he walked slowly, his eyes slightly teary. not out of vanity, but because of the memories of everything he had experienced up to that point. He remembered the days when he was called the backyard mechanic, the looks of disdain, the moments when he doubted himself, and now, there, surrounded by applause and flashes, all that seemed distant, but still alive enough to remind him of where he came from. If this story touches you in any way, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who deserves to hear it. Let's spread inspiration together. In his final speech, he had the chance to say a few words to the audience. He could have spoken about his journey, the challenges, his businessman father, or the titles he now carried, but he preferred to speak about the beginning. Everything I know I learned with grease-stained hands, with mistakes that taught me more than successes, with the advice of an old man with white hair who never stopped believing in me. If I'm here today, it's not because of my last name. It's because of the persistence of each day in which no one saw me. Yet I kept doing my best. The audience was silent for a few seconds before erupting in applause again. It was one of those rare moments when even the most skeptical become emotional. And as he left the stage, Mateo was embraced by Elias, whose eyes were red and hands trembling. No words were needed. That hug was everything. After the competition, Mateo realized that something had changed, not only in the way others saw him, but in the way he saw himself. For the first time, he felt that he had earned a legitimate place without having to hide his origins, yet without leaning on them. He had shown the country that talent, when it comes from truth, does not need pedigree. Still, he did not let himself be carried away by sudden fame. He continued waking up early, drinking the same simple coffee and caring for engines with the same zeal. But now, young aspiring mechanics began to seek him out. Some arrived timidly, asking if they could learn from him. Others sent messages thanking him. And for the inspiration, Mateo always made room. He never refused advice, a lesson, or a conversation. He knew how much it mattered to find someone who believed in you when the world seemed not to notice your existence. One day, one of those boys showed up at the workshop. He was slight, with trembling hands and a curious look. He said he lived in the neighboring area and followed all of Mateo's videos. "My dream is to work in this field, but no one takes it seriously because my family thinks a mechanic is for people with no future," he confessed. Mateo listened carefully, just as Elias had listened to him years ago. "Then do this," he said, handing the boy a screwdriver. "Today you will start by helping to take apart this carburetor. Later we'll see about the rest." The boy smiled as if he had won a prize. For Mateo, it was precisely this kind of moment that truly made it all worthwhile. It was like giving back to the world everything he himself had received in the form of silent opportunities, small gestures that change entire trajectories. And at that moment, more than a competition winner, more than an heir or an award-winning mechanic, he felt complete, because he was exactly where he had always wanted to be, truly making a difference. As time went by, Mateo began dividing his weeks between two worlds that once seemed incompatible: the simplicity of the workshop and the complexity of strategic meetings at the company headquarters. He learned to read reports, to understand the logic of investments, and even to participate in decisions about the future of the national automotive industry. Yet he never lost the habit of walking through the production corridors, talking with the technicians, and listening to suggestions from the most veteran employees. While other heirs worried about stock prices and quarterly profits, he cared about the sound of engines and the satisfaction of those who got their hands dirty. Some executives frowned upon this unexecutive behavior, but Mateo's father, now more present, knew that it was precisely that authenticity that made his son someone special. Still, not everything was easy. With exposure came pressure. Mateo began to deal with unfair comparisons, unrealistic expectations, and spiteful comments from those who insisted on diminishing his merit. He only got where he is because of his father. some would say between the lines, ignoring the years of effort even before his last name came to light. He tried not to be affected, but there were days when the weight was too heavy. In those moments, his escape was always the same, returning to the neighborhood, sitting on the sidewalk bench in front of the workshop and talking with Elias. There, over a cup of coffee and an old story from the veteran mechanic, everything made sense again. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Mateo," Elias would say in his husky, firm voice. "Just keep being who you always were. That's enough." And, in a way, it truly was enough. Because despite everything, he remained that young man who found himself in simplicity, and it was there that his greatness stayed alive. Over time, Mateo began to realize that his story transcended the limits of mechanics. In lectures for young apprentices, in interviews on television programs, or even in casual conversations with colleagues, his journey became a symbol of something greater, the real possibility of rising without losing one's essence. It was common to see people become emotional when hearing about his early years in the workshop, about the humiliations he endured silently, about the moments when he almost gave up. And at the same time, it was inspiring for many to see that he did not need to hide his roots or exalt his last name to be respected. Mateo spoke with the same naturalness with which he assembled an engine, direct, simple, truthful. And it was precisely this that made him so different. He did not try to appear greater than he was. He simply was. One day, during one of those events, an elderly lady approached him at the end of his lecture. She had calloused hands, a firm look, and an emotional voice. "My son gave up on everything because he thought no one valued those who come from below. Today he's there, sitting in the audience, with his eyes shining because of him," she said, pointing to a young, timid man who was struggling to hold back tears. Mateo approached him, shook his hand firmly and said, "You only need to believe in yourself before expecting others to believe. The rest, life will sort out." That was not a prepared speech. It was advice from someone who knew exactly what it was like to carry doubts in one's heart every day. And at that moment, once again, Mateo understood that his mission might be greater than he had imagined. It was not just about cars, engines, or competitions. It was about opening paths. It was about being a bridge. It was about proving that greatness is not about appearance. It's about attitude. Despite everything he had achieved, Mateo continued to wrestle with a silent doubt that had accompanied him from the beginning. How to preserve his essence in a world that constantly tried to shape him. He saw other young people in leadership roles, many of them consumed by vanity, losing their sense of purpose in exchange for status, and that frightened him. He did not want to become someone who only saw numbers, goals, and charts. He wanted to keep seeing people, smelling the grease, listening to the roar of engines, and learning from every situation. That's why whenever he felt he was straying too far from his roots, he returned to the workshop. Sometimes, without telling anyone, he would just show up, put on his apron, and help change the oil of a popular car as if nothing had changed. It was his way of reminding himself where he came from and why he started. On one such visit to the workshop, he encountered an old man who used to appear there in his early learning years. It was an old client, the owner of an aging combi that was always breaking down. This time, the man returned with his head bowed and his speech subdued. He said that the vehicle had finally given out and that he probably wouldn't have enough money to fix everything. Mateo listened carefully, asked to see the car, and realized that with a few simple adjustments, it could still be made to run. He worked right there without charging anything. In the end, he handed the key back to the old man with a light smile. "Now it can handle a few more good kilometers." The man gripped his hand tightly and said, "You haven't changed, kid. You're still that same pure-hearted boy." And it was true. No matter how much the world pulled him toward luxurious halls and glass offices, it was in the simplicity of that gesture that Mateo recognized himself completely. Over the following months, Mateo realized that his presence was beginning to transform even the corporate environment of the company. Gradually, some processes were rethought. Departments began to listen more to production line workers, and social projects aimed at training young apprentices started to materialize, initiatives he made sure to follow closely. He did not want to be merely a pretty symbol on the company's organizational chart, but a true agent of change. He proposed the creation of a scholarship program for novice mechanics, offered free workshops in underprivileged communities, and even brought Elias in to give practical classes within the company. "If you're going to teach real mechanics, do it with someone who knows the smell of grease," he said, drawing laughter from the employees. That wasn't a marketing strategy. It was in coherence with everything he had lived. At one of these internal meetings, a young employee from the assembly department timidly approached him to express his gratitude. He said that before knowing Mateo's story, he had thought of giving up everything to try something more valued. But after seeing someone like him go so far without ceasing to be who he was, he regained his enthusiasm. "You made me believe that it's still worth doing things the right way," he said, his eyes shining. Mateo listened with humility, but inside he felt a different kind of pride, not the kind shouted from rooftops, but the silent kind that beats in the chest. It was as if every simple gesture reverberated more than any advertising campaign. And perhaps that was what motivated him most. Knowing that he could be a bridge without having to build walls, that he could grow without straying from his origins, and that, above all, he could still fix the world, even if it was just a little piece at a time, like assembling an engine with patience and truth. Despite the recognition and positive changes he promoted, Mateo never lost his sense of reality. He knew that outside the spotlight, there were still thousands of people with wasted talent due to lack of opportunities, support, or simply because they were judged by their appearance before even speaking. This awareness drove him to continue with his social projects. Once, he was invited to speak at a technical school in the countryside. He arrived alone, driving an old car he had restored as a hobby, and was greeted by curious eyes from students who expected to find someone in a suit and out of reach. But a few minutes of conversation were enough to break the distance. Mateo sat on the floor of the school's workshop, grabbed a random part, and began to explain simply, as if he were among friends. And in that environment, more than a speaker, he became a mirror, a real mirror, without filters, where the young could see themselves with hope. After the lecture, a teacher pulled him aside, visibly moved. She said that many of those students came from families marked by violence, poverty, and neglect. She said that in all her years of teaching, she had never seen their eyes so attentive as they were that afternoon. "You have no idea what you have done here today," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Mateo only smiled and thanked her. He had never intended to be a hero. He just wanted to show that it is possible. That the road may be hard, yes, but not impossible. And that no one should be judged by their origins, by their uniform, by the color of their hand, or by the way they speak. That was why he kept moving forward, even when exhaustion weighed him down. Because he knew that somewhere, someone might be waiting exactly for that kind of inspiration. Someone who, like he once was, only needed a chance to awaken what they already carried inside. One morning, while organizing some papers in the improvised office at the back of the workshop, Mateo received a letter unlike the usual ones. It was not an invitation to an event, nor a business proposal. It was handwritten in firm, yet emotionally charged script. It was from his biological mother. Until then, he had never spoken openly about her, not even knowing much of her story. He only knew that she and his father had had a brief, turbulent relationship and that their separation had been marked by difficult decisions. But in that letter, there was something deeper. She said she had followed his journey from afar in silence and had always hoped for him, even though she wasn't present. "I needed to see you grow on your own," "Without my wounds interfering with your path," she wrote. Mateo read, every line with a lump in his throat. He did not know what to feel. It was as if a new chapter of his story had opened unexpectedly. In the following days, he was torn between the impulse to search for her and the fear of stirring up something that already seemed healed. He spoke with Elias, who had always been more than a mentor. He was his moral compass. "Sometimes life holds meetings that only happen when we're ready," the old mechanic said, with the wisdom of one who understands timing. Mateo thought deeply, eventually deciding to reply to the letter, not with grand speeches, but with the simplicity that defined him. He wrote just a few lines, thanking her for her words, saying he was open to reuniting, but without haste, without idealized expectations. He did not want to force the filling of gaps. He only wanted to allow life to take its course, with the same lightness with which he adjusted an engine, respecting time, the proper fit, and the need for each part to find its place. A few weeks later, the reunion happened. It was in a small cafe, away from the curious eyes of the press or the town's acquaintances. Mateo arrived first, as usual, and sat near the window. He was nervous, but tried to hide it while watching the street. When she entered, their eyes met immediately. She was a woman with a strong demeanor, her hair already gray, and a firm posture. But there was something in her eyes that reminded him of his own, a mix of intensity and calm, as if she carried a wealth of life within. The embrace was silent, without extravagant words, just a long and sincere gesture. One of those that says everything without needing to say anything. They spoke carefully about the past, about silences, about doubts, about everything that had never been said before. And at the end of the conversation, Mateo left with the feeling that although some stories are never completely resolved, it is possible to give them new meaning. That experience brought him another lesson: the importance of accepting life's complexity without trying to control it entirely. He understood that not everything needs a perfect ending, and that some relationships can blossom even after being dormant for a long time. With a lighter heart, he returned to his routine with an even more humane perspective on everything he did. Conversations with company employees became more sensitive, discussions with apprentices more empathetic. Even his way of teaching changed. Now, besides technique, he spoke about choices, about forgiveness, about listening to others. It was as if that encounter had awakened a dormant part within him. And deep down, he knew that this was yet another gear that needed to turn inside him. After all, even the most powerful engines need fine adjustments to achieve their best performance. And with him, it was no different. Over time, Mateo found a new rhythm in life. He was no longer that young man full of doubts who only wanted to prove his worth. Now he understood that his mission was not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to live truthfully, building bridges, inspiring paths, and valuing the small, everyday victories. He still enjoyed getting his hands dirty with grease, spending hours working on old engines, but he had also learned to appreciate conversations at meeting tables, strategic planning sessions, and even institutional presentations. He discovered that it was possible to occupy different spaces without losing his identity. It was possible to be technical and sensitive, an heir and a worker, an example and an apprentice at the same time. And that awareness made him even stronger. Then, in one of those meetings on a rainy afternoon, someone from the board proposed launching an advertising campaign featuring his image as the company's poster boy. The idea was to exploit his journey as an inspiring narrative to strengthen the brand. The proposal was tempting: high investments, videos on national networks, primetime interviews. But Mateo refused, politely but firmly. "My story is not a product, it is a process, and a process must be respected, not sold," he said, ending the discussion. Some were bothered, others admired his stance. For him, it was simple. He did not want to be the symbol of something packaged and sold. He wanted to remain a reference through his attitude, his everyday example, the way he treated people. and the manner in which he conducted his work, because he knew that when the essence is true, it does not need to be stamped. It reveals itself on its own, in the details, in gestures, in silences, and that was what he carried with him every day, whether in the simple neighborhood workshop or in the corridors of high management. The same essence, the same truth. Over time, Mateo realized that his influence was not only in the words he spoke, but primarily in the choices he made. That is why he decided to invest in an old project that had always lingered around him: the creation of a free school workshop for low-income young people, a space where theory and practice met, where mechanics were taught with the same care as values are taught. He gathered friends from the workshop, company technicians and volunteer teachers, and set everything up in a deactivated hall that he himself renovated little by little. He painted walls, repaired workbenches, repurposed old tools, and named the space Workshop of the Future. There, young people learned to assemble engines, but also learned about ethics, commitment, empathy, and persistence. It was more than a course. It was a space for real transformation. Gradually, the Workshop of the Future became a reference in the region. Companies began hiring the graduates from there, and even the local government started visiting the project to understand its social impact. But even with its success, Mateo remained present, personally teaching whenever he could, helping in the practical classes, sharing his stories, and listening to others. For him, that place was the real trophy of everything he had lived. There was no competition there, no status, no vanity. There was purpose, and that was what fulfilled him the most. Many asked why he still got so involved with the classes when he already had so many responsibilities. He always replied the same: "Because I know what it's like to have talent and not have an opportunity. And if I can be that opportunity for someone, every minute is worth it." It was there, in the attentive eyes of the students, in the gleam of grease-stained hands, in the hope that was reborn with every class, that Mateo found confirmation that he was on the right path, the path he chose with his heart, not with his last name. One late afternoon, after a class at the Workshop of the Future, Mateo walked alone through the streets of the neighborhood where it all began. The sky was tinged with orange hues, the distant sound of children playing and the familiar smell of homemade food brought forth memories he cherished. He passed in front of the house where he grew up, now renovated by another family, but still with the same rusty iron gate. For a moment, he stopped there, looking at that simple structure that had been the stage for so many silent dreams. He remembered the days when he disassembled old fans just to understand how they worked, the moments when he improvised parts with recycled materials, and how, even without many resources, there was always an entire world of possibilities in that small backyard. Sitting on the sidewalk, he thought about everything he had experienced: the competitions, the challenges, the judgments, the reunions, the lessons. And above all, he thought of the boy he once was, the one who often doubted himself, who swallowed his anger in the face of humiliation, who dreamed big even when everything seemed too tight. And he felt a calm pride, a kind of gratitude that did not explode into euphoria, but warmed his heart from within. Because now he knew everything made sense. Every step, every choice, every silence, nothing was in vain. And no matter how much life had taken him to places he had never imagined reaching, his favorite place in the world remained that: the worn concrete ground, the sounds of the neighborhood, the living memory of who he was. Because deep down, true achievement was not about what he gained, but about everything he managed to preserve: his essence, his humility, and the certainty that being great is, above all, knowing how to remain whole even when the world tries to break you. Not long after, Mateo was invited to participate in an international congress on innovation in the automotive industry. The event would gather engineers, businessmen, and industry leaders from several countries. Once again, the spotlight turned to him. But unlike previous times, he no longer felt out of place. not because he had grown accustomed to the prestige, but because he had already understood that his place did not depend on the environment. It depended on how he positioned himself within it. He went up on stage with his usual demeanor, calm, steady, and with a look that conveyed truth. He spoke about sustainability, about accessibility in technologies, and about the role of mechanics in social transformation. But what really caught people's attention was when he spoke about the workshop of the future and the young people being trained there. People who, like him, only needed a chance to show what they were capable of. At the end of his presentation, representatives of international universities and major companies approached him, wanting to see the project up close. He received partnership proposals, invitations to give lectures, and opportunities that could take him to a new professional level. But before responding to any proposal, Mateo did what he always did. He went home, walked to the workshop, spoke with Elias, and reflected in silence. He was grateful for everything, but he knew that every decision carried consequences, and he did not want to lose himself amid the success. The next day, he replied to everyone with elegance, thanked them for the open doors, but made it clear his focus remained on local social transformation. If he were to expand, he wanted to do it responsibly, without losing the essence of the project. "I'm not here to become a celebrity. I'm here to build bridges where there once were only walls," he wrote in one of his responses. And with that, he once again reaffirmed his identity, solid, integral, and impossible to be molded by the fleeting shine of fame. On a rainy night, while organizing some tools in the shed of the workshop of the future, Mateo was surprised by a group of former students who arrived unannounced. Bringing simple cakes, cheap soda, and wide smiles, they said they wanted to celebrate with him the project's first anniversary. It was an impromptu celebration, without decorations or speeches, but loaded with meaning. Some shared how they were now working in great workshops, others showed photos of their very first workbenches. One of them, with teary eyes, revealed that before joining the project, he had thought about giving up everything. Today, he was a team leader at a dealership. Mateo listened in silence, his heart tight and his eyes shining. No grand tribute was necessary. The greatest reward was that, seeing the real, concrete, human impact that his journey was having on the world. During the small celebration, one of the students raised a plastic cup and made an impromptu toast to the guy who never forgot where he came from, who taught us that humility is not the absence of greatness, but the most beautiful way to live it. The simple, direct words echoed in the ensuing silence. Mateo smiled, thanked them with a discreet nod, and, as he always did, shifted the focus to others. "This project isn't mine, it's ours. Everyone here is an important piece in this mechanism, and that's how things work well, when no one wants to be more than necessary." They applauded, laughed, ate cake, and cleaned up the mess at the end of the night like a true team. And when everyone had left, Mateo stayed alone for a few minutes, looking at the empty space, still with the sound of voices echoing in his mind. It was there that he felt most whole. It was there that everything made sense. A few days later, Mateo received an unexpected visit at the workshop of the future. It was a man in an elegant suit, with a rigid posture and an analytical look, a representative of one of the country's largest car manufacturers. He said he was there at the request of the company's board, who wanted to see the project up close and speak personally with Mateo about a possible institutional partnership. The proposal was clear: robust funding, national expansion, and integration with the industry's professional training programs. Everything seemed grand, promising, almost irresistible. But while the man spoke with numbers and projections, Mateo thought of every detail of what he had built there with his own hands. He did not want the project to lose its soul, become a marketing showcase, or cease being a place of welcome and instead become a corporate display. He asked for time to think, not out of distrust, but out of care. That place was more than a technical center. It was a space for personal transformation. In the following days, Mateo reflected deeply. He spoke with former students, with volunteers, with Elias, and even with his biological mother, who now, though discreetly, was part of his daily life. Every opinion was important, but the final decision had to be his. And then, after gathering everyone involved, he did something few expected. He accepted the partnership, but with an unyielding clause. The project would have complete pedagogical and social autonomy. No action could interfere with the community essence of the workshop of the future. The representative of the car manufacturer hesitated at first, but faced with Mateo's firmness and the project's already significant impact, eventually accepted. The expansion would begin carefully, without haste, maintaining the original spirit. And at that moment, Mateo felt he had made the right choice. He was learning more and more that growing is not about adapting to the system. It's about making the system adapt to what really matters. With the new phase of the project underway, Mateo began traveling to other cities, helping to establish new workshop of the future units in regions where opportunity was a distant luxury. Every place had its own reality, its own pains, its own stories. But in all of them, he found something in common. Young people with a sparkle in their eyes, waiting for just one chance. In a small town in the northeast, he met a 17-year-old girl who disassembled old bicycles by herself in her backyard and dreamed of working in automotive mechanics. In another, in the south of the country, he saw a shy boy who had dropped out of school, yet was capable of identifying engine faults just by listening to the sounds. Mateo saw pieces of himself in them and made sure to welcome, teach, and guide them, even if only for a few hours. He knew that sometimes a single conversation can change the course of an entire life. Amid all this, Mateo began receiving invitations to assume executive roles within his family's own company. High positions with astronomical salaries and direct influence in strategic decisions. His father insisted with good arguments, saying that he had the preparation, the respect of the market, and the legitimacy to be there. But Mateo refused more than once, not out of disdain for the position, but out of conviction. He knew where his place was, and that place was not in a room with leather chairs and panoramic windows. It was on the workshop floor, in direct contact with people, in the sound of engines, and in the silence of simple gestures. "I wasn't born to boss around. I was born to get things done," he once told his father in a sincere conversation. And for the first time, he saw on his father's face a smile that came not from reason, but from the heart. A smile that said, "You are exactly where you should be." Over time, Mateo's story began to be studied in universities, analyzed in documentaries, and cited as an example in leadership congresses. But he continued living the same way, waking up early, going to the workshop, visiting new classes at the workshop of the future, and personally taking care of every detail of his projects. He still washed his hands with plain soap, still laughed with Elias about old jokes, still ate at the same neighborhood bar. Fame never went to his head because, for him, fame was just noise. What truly mattered was the silent impact he left wherever he went. Once, during a visit to a new unit under construction, a boy approached him and asked, "What do I need to do to be like you?" Mateo thought for a few seconds and answered sincerely, "Just be yourself, but have the courage to keep going even when no one believes." That was the kind of lesson Mateo had learned in practice. There was no magic formula, no shortcuts, no inheritance that was worth more than a well-built purpose. That was what he wanted to pass on. When he turned 30, he was surprised with an homage organized by the former students of the workshop's first class. They gathered everyone in a hall, decorated it with old tools and photos of his journey, and prepared a simple plaque with the phrase, "Here was born a master who never stopped being a student." Mateo could not hold back his tears. It wasn't for the recognition, it was for the symbolism of it all. It was the realization that what he had built, with sweat and truth, had become something that transcended his own story. And it was there, in that moment of silent emotion and shared gratitude, that he understood his greatest victory was not winning a competition. It was having touched lives, multiplied paths, and proven that with character, humility, and love for what you do, it is possible to transform the world, even if it's one engine at a time. In the following months, Mateo decided to take an important step. He began training new instructors so that the project wouldn't depend solely on him. He knew that for the workshop of the future to become enduring, he needed to decentralize, trust, and multiply knowledge. He chose committed. Former students offered them pedagogical training and taught not only mechanical techniques, but also the values that underpinned everything. More important than teaching someone to fix an engine is teaching them to mend the self-esteem of someone whom life tried to break, he would say in meetings with the team. The idea was clear, not to train just mechanics, but life mentors. And gradually, he saw the project gain autonomy. Each new unit had its own identity, but all carried the same spirit, that no one is too small to dream big. At the same time, Mateo also began writing his memoirs, not to promote himself, but to record the story that had so often been silenced by prejudice. He wanted that one day other young people would read it and see themselves in its lines. He wrote in the early hours of the morning after long, hard days at work, sitting at the same wooden table where he had disassembled carburetors so many times. He wrote with honesty, without embellishment, as if talking with a friend. He recalled painful episodes, lessons, encounters, and difficult decisions, and the more he wrote, the more he realized that his story wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who insists on moving forward, even when everything seems to say it's not worth it. It was about resilience, about identity, about dignity, and above all, about love for what you do. A love that isn't taught in any manual, but is felt in the touch of a tool, in the attentive gaze of the apprentice, in the silence of someone who watches and is inspired. That was what he wanted to leave behind, not a legacy of fame, but of meaning. One night, after finishing another chapter of the book, Mateo went out for a walk around the neighborhood. The sky was clear, the street nearly empty, and the distant sound of an old radio filled the air with a song he remembered from his childhood. He passed by the square where he used to play with old parts, by the corners where, as a boy, he watched cars pass and wondered how they worked inside. Every corner of that place seemed to hold a piece of his journey. He stopped in front of the old workshop, which now operated with a new team, but still retained the same soul. He leaned against the gate and stayed there for a few minutes, just breathing in the familiar scent of oil and rust, remembering who he was before everything happened. That moment of silence spoke more than any speech. It was proof that even with a constantly moving world, some roots never get lost. It was at that moment that Elias appeared, coming from the neighboring house with the same serene expression as always. "I knew I'd find you here," he said, in that rough yet affectionate way. They sat side by side on the curb, as they had many times in the past. They talked little but laughed a lot. They recalled stories, talked about the students, the challenges, the life that goes on. And before they parted, Elias looked deep into Mateo's eyes and said, "You did more than any of us ever imagined, but what makes me most proud is not where you've reached. It's the fact that you're still sitting here with me on the curb, as always." Mateo smiled and replied, "Because this is where I come from, and it's from here that I never want to leave." That night, as he walked home with a calm heart, he understood that his greatest achievement was not in titles or material gains. It was in the ability to remain whole even after becoming great. In time, Mateo's book was finished and published, but he turned down all the major publishers who wanted to turn his story into a market product. He opted for an independent, simple publication, distributed free of charge in workshop schools, public libraries, and community centers. He wanted his story to reach those who really needed it, not on luxurious shelves, but in the calloused hands of those who needed to believe in themselves. The book took on a life of its own, was shared among apprentices, quoted in classrooms, and became an inspiration for similar projects in other states. But Mateo did not change because of that. He remained the same. He continued teaching patiently, listening attentively, learning humbly, because deep down, he knew that the true value of life lies in the things no one sees, in respect, in care, in listening, in truth. Once, he was invited to give a lecture at a renowned international university. The auditorium was packed with brilliant young people, renowned professors and dignitaries. Mateo took the stage in his simple way, his shirt rolled up to the elbows and a serene look on his face. When he began to speak, he did not bring data or charts. He told stories. He spoke of people, of emotions, of choices, and in the end, he said something that remained etched in everyone's mind. You may inherit a name, a company, even a fortune, but character is not given to you. You build it day by day, in the way you treat others, in the silence of your decisions, in what you do when no one is watching. The audience rose in applause, but Mateo only thanked them with a timid gesture and left the stage just as he had entered, at peace, with his feet on the ground and his soul whole. Today, years later, Mateo still lives in the same neighborhood. The house has been renovated, the workshop has grown, but he still walks to work. The neighborhood children greet him by name, the elders stop to chat, and the young still see him as a living inspiration. Every now and then, a news crew appears, wanting to revive his story, but he rarely accepts interviews. He prefers that they talk about the project, the students, the workshops, not about him, because he understands that his role now is to be a seed, spreading ideas, shaping people, opening paths. And if in the end someone says they moved forward because they heard his story, that will be more than enough, because true greatness is about touching lives, and that he always knew how to do. And so Mateo goes on, not as the son of a magnate, not as the champion of mechanics, not as the face of a brand, but as that young man who one day heard mocking laughter in the middle of the workshop, lowered his head and kept working. The one who learned early that dignity is not something you wear, it is something you build. That respect is not bought, it is earned. And that a person's worth is never in their last name, but in the way they choose to live. He still fine-tunes engines, still teaches with a sparkle in his eyes, still gets emotional with every other person's success. And if there is one thing that defines him to this day, it is not the title of heir nor public recognition. It is the courage to continue being exactly who he is, whole, simple, human. Mateo didn't win by being different. He won because he never stopped being himself, and that is why his story does not end. It continues in every workshop that is born, in every student who awakens, in every engine that starts running again. Because as long as there is someone willing to restart with truth, Mateo's legacy will keep pulsing, silent, firm, and eternal. If this story inspired you, show your support with a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss another story like this. And of course, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that true greatness lies in essence.